I bet you did not expect this episode, and that's what we're going to talk about today, because today we're going to talk about the Spanish Inquisition. And I'd rather ask, as always, as I always ask my guests, where did the interest in the Spanish Inquisition come from? Was it around Atkinson Street, or did you know about it way before?
No, actually, I didn't know much about the Inquisition. I was interested in religious persecution. I was interested in religious conflict, but I didn't think about studying the Inquisition. I accidentally found out about it just when I was at the University of Notre Dame. In 1997, they acquired one of the largest private collections of Inquisition documents, and I got to work with them. I could read Spanish and Latin, so I was in the right place at the right time.
Qué bien.
Yeah.
So, of course, the first question has to be, could you or could you not expect the Spanish Inquisition?
Well, it all depends. So they certainly could surprise people, and they kept witness testimony a secret, so you didn't always know if people were denouncing you, and so you might be surprised. But generally speaking, one of the things that the Spanish Inquisition wanted was for everyone to know they were coming. So they were not a secret. They published edicts of grace, edicts of faith to warn people that they'd better confess before someone denounced them. And that's why they had public sentencing, public executions, because they wanted everyone to know.
And when was the founding of the Spanish? Why did they found? As famously, Spain was invaded by Umayyad Caliphate in, I was a Muslim country. Was that part? And when it left, they became Christian again. Was this partly why the Spanish Inquisition was formed, when they to persecute the Islamic people of who practice the faith of Islam?
Not so much, not at first. The Inquisition actually is older than Spain itself. Inquisition is actually just a Roman form of legal procedure, so it goes right back to the time of Christ. It could be also translated just an inquest or an investigation. So it's a very old form of legal investigation of any kind of crime, and it was sometimes used for heresy, sometimes for witchcraft, not just by the church, but by the Roman state. And so when Roman law wasn't being used anymore in the early Middle Ages, nevertheless, it was still theoretically available. Any bishop could use Inquisition techniques to investigate criminals. It had nothing to do with Islam. And in fact, theoretically, when it was used by bishops, by people in the church, it was only to be used against Christians. You could not use it against Muslims or Jews.
I thought they wanted to prosecute non-believers.
No, so this is where it gets very interesting, though, because normally the Inquisition, like in the rest of Europe, they had Inquisitions in northern Italy and southern France that were targeting Christian heretics. And that was normal in the 13th century with this revival of Roman law. But in Spain, they had a special situation because after the 1390s, there were a number of pogroms against Jews. A number of Jews were forced to convert to Christianity. And these were known as the conversos, the converts, sometimes insultingly called marranos. And these people were suspected, even though they had been baptized, often by force. Of course, they weren't really all that enthusiastic to be Christians. So they were suspected, often rightly, of still practicing Jewish rituals and eating kosher food and remaining essentially Jewish, even though they had been baptized. So you see, there's a legal fiction here. They're Jews who were forced to convert to accept baptism. They still consider themselves Jewish, but legally they are now considered Christian. That means the Inquisition can approach them as Christians. And the crime that they would be committing was the crime of apostasy, to go away from your Christianity by returning to your Jewish roots. So at first, the Spanish Inquisition was just an evolution of this old Roman medieval anti-Christian way of proceeding against heretics. And there were inquisitions in some parts of Spain, but it wasn't very common. until 1478. So the Spanish Inquisition itself was only founded in 1478 by Isabel and Ferdinand. These are the king and queen who make Spain, because Isabel was Queen of Castile, Ferdinand was King of Aragon, today Catalonia, and the two made Spain in the 1470s. And one of their new ideas was, let's spread the Inquisition, let's really crack down on all these suspected Jewish converts to cleanse our new country. After that, they started to do the same to Muslims as well, because after that, they started to force Muslims to convert.
So is that part of why there's not many Muslims left in Spain today, since it was used of the entire Islamic part of the world, but today they don't hardly see it's a mostly Christian country.
Yeah, there were a few stages. So from the time of the Caliphate, around the year 1000, that starts to collapse. And then you have figures like El Cid fighting against the Muslims, sometimes fighting for them. There was a slow reconquest of some areas. So by the 1200s, Valencia had fallen, Cordoba had fallen, eventually Seville. But there were still many, many Muslims in Granada and also in Valencia, because they were allowed to keep their religion at first. The conquerors actually, even though they called themselves crusaders, they were very interested in keeping Muslim peasants on the land and paying taxes as Muslims. So they didn't convert them. But it was only after 1492 that Isabel and Ferdinand, these were really the main characters here, these kings, they conquered Granada, the last Muslim holdout. They did promise freedom of religion at first to the Muslims of Granada as well. But by the 1520s, there had been a number of rebellions, and the Muslims were, again, technically forced to all accept baptism. Now, even after the 1520s, everybody knew that most of them were not really Christians. So just like the Jews, they were now subject to Inquisition. But in many cases, they were allowed quite openly to continue as Muslims. And this lasted right up until the 1600s. And the last of these so-called Moriscos, the converted Muslims, were only expelled from Spain around 1609, 1610. And that's when they were shipped across to North Africa. That's why there's no Muslims after that year, 1609.
And what could you expect if the Spanish Inquisition came knocking on your door?
Well, that's where
talked a little bit about it, but if you could elaborate more in detail.
That's where things got much more scary. So, you might expect they were coming, but once they actually arrested you, you had no idea what to expect because the procedure was kept secret, the testimony was kept secret so that you wouldn't know who was testifying against you. And the logic they used was, well, you should confess anyway. It's very different from later legal procedures like in America where you have the right to fight for your innocence even if you're actually guilty. In this idea, God is going to judge you in the end anyway. So if you're guilty, you have to confess. So they don't give you the right to defend yourself. And torture could be used, but only under certain circumstances. So normally, your best chance was if you confessed everything that you could possibly have done wrong, and they accepted that, normally you would then be allowed to go with just a minor punishment.
What would the minor punishment be?
Sometimes it was just to hold a candle in the back of the church on Sunday to humiliate you, to show that you had been caught, that you had asked for forgiveness. So again, the Christian theory, there was a Christian theology behind this, was that you should confess your sins and then you would be given a penance. So this is not just the Inquisition, this is the Catholic Church generally, right? If someone confesses their sins, they're given a penance. The only difference here is that it was somewhat public. So you might have to carry a candle, you might have to wear a special hat or a special clothing. You might even be publicly whipped or have to walk in a procession. So there were different degrees. But if you...
What was the worst punishment to get if you were?
Yeah, technically, you should only be killed or executed if you had relapsed. So if you were caught a second time, then you would be executed because your first promise to be good was obviously a lie. So these are called the relapsed, and the relapsed would then be executed quite often. They would be offered, if they were again willing to admit their guilt and to beg for mercy, they would be strangled before the fire was lit. But the body would then be burned. And even in cases where someone had already died in prison, or they had died long before the trial, they would dig up the body and burn that.
Oh, sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
But
It was part of the public persona to scare everyone and warn everyone this is what happens.
but how did people of Spain view? I'm mostly referring to the Christian Spain of Spain. How did they view the Spanish Inquisition? Did they respect them? Did they fear them themselves, or did they just think of it as a normal procedure?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about that. Historians have a hard time, we can't do public opinion surveys, so we look at evidence, and there's evidence on all sides. There were certainly people who did not like the Inquisition, and we have a number of cases where inquisitors were actually murdered by popular mobs. So there were always people who did not like the Inquisition and sometimes were willing to take up arms against it. But whenever they had a public event, a sentencing or an execution, we also know that thousands of people came to watch, and they brought picnics and they brought their children. So many people also supported them.
So it
The
was
Inquisition,
like a French companion.
yeah, I mean, it lasted for hundreds of years, so obviously it had some public support.
What was required to become a part of the Inquisition? Do we know this?
Yeah, again, it evolved over time. At first, it was mostly manned by the bishops and their staff, and then by the religious orders, normally the Dominican order or the Franciscan order, but there were always exceptions. Then by the 1500s, it started to become more professional. And by the 1500s, the Spanish Inquisition became more and more staffed by lawyers. So it was, it really did evolve from being mostly church controlled to becoming more professional, more political, and more legalistic.
Was it popular to be a part of the Spanish Inquisition?
Again, it depends. You certainly could become, unfriendly to your neighbors, and so some neighbors might not like you, but there were privileges that came with it, very valuable privileges. So people did want to become a member. They could, if you weren't one of the judges, you could become a familiar, which would be the sort of a soldier who would help them do the arrests. And a familiar would get tax credits, would also be allowed to carry weapons where other people were not allowed to carry weapons. So it meant you could bully your neighbors. And it allowed you to, again, you could use the power and the threat of the Inquisition to force people to give you better deals on real estate and things like that. So yeah, there was a lot of prestige and a lot of power that came from being a part of the Inquisition.
Was it corruption involved as well? Like you mentioned bullying their neighbor and getting deals. How many was it easier to get corrupted? Like, let's say you catch me as practicing Jew.
Yeah.
And if I paid you off, would that work at all? If I was rich and I wanted to pay you off to avoid persecution, would that work?
Sometimes, yes. Again, it's hard to generalize because this is something that lasted for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So there were some inquisitors who were more corrupt than others, but there's a lot of evidence of bribery. There's also a lot of evidence of corruption in terms of the denunciations, because if you're having a fight with your neighbor, say over some land, one way to get rid of your neighbor is to denounce them to the Inquisition and get rid of them that way. And also there were financial issues at stake because the kings didn't want to pay for the Inquisition, and their idea was that when you convict someone, you could not only punish them personally, but you could also confiscate their wealth. and that money would be confiscated by the Inquisition. So the Inquisition had a monetary reason to arrest especially rich people, and yes, either bully them, accept bribes, or just convict them and seize all their assets.
Hmm. So you can take all my assets if you want to, and you arrest me instead of just taking a bribe. That would be easier.
Yeah, bribes. It's always dangerous though, because you give a bribe, you still don't have any guarantee that they're not going to
Yeah.
still arrest you and keep the money. But there was a lot of politics involved. So we have lots of cases where wealthy Jewish families, and sometimes not just Jewish, there were a number of very high profile Christians who were arrested by the Inquisition as well for various reasons.
So why would the Christian become persecuted by an
But
Inquisition?
it would be mostly as a result of a heresy. So again, that's the normal rule here is the Inquisition is supposed to attack people who are heretics, who deviate somehow from what the church considers to be orthodoxy. So converted Muslims or Jews who go back to their religion, they're apostates. That's a form of heresy. For Christians, there were many heresies in the Middle Ages, the Waldensians, the Cathars, but in the 15th, 16th century, this started to develop into Protestantism. So by the 1520s, the main reason that a Christian would be arrested was if they were sympathetic to Lutheranism or to Calvinism. And one of the most famous of these high-profile arrests was actually the head of the Spanish Church and someone who worked in the Inquisition himself. This is Bartolomé de Carranza.
So why was he arrested in the first place?
Yeah, he was arrested on suspicion that he was a Lutheran sympathizer, even though he was the Catholic Archbishop of Toledo.
So just for being a sympathizer with the Protestant, he was arrested.
Yeah, and of course, because he was the head of the church, there's a lot of politics involved here too. So
yeah, of course.
He was very close to the king, Charles V, and he was at his deathbed when he died. But then Charles's son, Philip II, reversed a lot of Charles's policies, and one of the first people he got rid of was the Archbishop Carranza. So there's politics there, there's power, there's money, there's corruption, all these things at stake.
We talked about corruption in the Inquisition as well, but what if they were caught by the bishop for being corrupt? Would they be expelled from the Inquisition, or what didn't it really matter? They were prosecuted. The people they caught were they prosecuted. The bishop didn't care, or did they? What were the consequences of being caught of being corrupt?
Yeah. I mean, just like today, if you're good at corruption and you pay off the right people, then you can get away with it. But no, it was a dangerous game. And there were many cases actually where the church did intervene and many inquisitors were arrested on charges of corruption. In fact, I mean, we talked before about heretics being the main group of Christians that were targeted, but I should also mention that the Inquisition did get used a lot internally against Catholic priests for various misdeeds, including corruption, also including sexual transgressions. This whole idea of sexual abuse by priests, this was also happening in the 16th century. And the Inquisition was used to punish those priests. So priests and inquisitors were punished for corruption. They were punished for sexual sins. They were punished if they were suspected of orthodox deviations from orthodoxy. It was still dangerous to be a priest. You faced a lot of scrutiny that way.
And I assume back then Catholic priests can get married as well.
That's right. So any sexual activity at all by a Catholic priest was a betrayal of their vows as a priest, and so arguably it's a form of heresy, especially if they don't apologize. I mean, again, you could get away with it pretty easily if you apologized, and we see this is still a problem with the sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church, right? People apologize and they just get moved on. That happened in this period too. But if you were unrepentant, if you were a repeat offender, then it could get quite serious.
And now let's move on to the Inquisition going to South America. And what were the, what was the job there? Because as they find a new land and they take over this the Latin American countries and Mexico and all the countries that were there, what were the job in there? Because there wasn't many Christians yet. There were, I assume there was very many Christians there at least. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so at first there was no Inquisition. The first people who went over were just conquistadors, they were soldiers. They would sometimes bring priests with them to hear their confessions, give them mass and last rites and so on. So there were a few priests who came over to serve the soldiers, the Spanish Christian soldiers. By the 1510s, there were enough Spanish settlers that there were bishops set up in Cuba, in the island of Hispaniola, which is today Haiti and Dominican Republic. And they started to actually use inquisitorial practices, as you say, against the Christians. Some of those first soldiers going across, some of them were conversos, some of them were converted Jews, some of them were converted Muslims. That's part of the reason they wanted to get out of Spain, to get away from the Inquisition. So they did inquisit some of the Christians in the New World. But you're right, by the vast majority, the local population was not Christian and conversions were slow at first. And in fact, again, just as they had done in Spain, at first, there was not a lot of interest in converting the Indians because they wanted to be able to force them to work and pay taxes at a higher rate than Christians. But by the 1530s, a more permanent, after the conquest of Mexico, a more permanent Spanish settlement started. And the first bishop, Juan de Zumárraga, actually did start using inquisitorial procedures even against newly converted Indians. So the same logic as we saw in Spain, an Indian is not subject to the Inquisition, but once he's baptized, he is. So we did have some executions of Indian leaders in the 1530s because they were accused of going back to their Indian faith after receiving baptism.
And was it, yeah, I don't know, said this as well, but it was so it would be used to those, let's say with Jews and Islam, as if they went back to practicing their original beliefs.
Exactly. Yeah, and so if they hadn't been baptized, they were not subject to the Inquisition. And the Inquisition, I mean, partly again because they wanted to make money, they still mostly arrested wealthy merchants, wealthy Christians. Arresting impoverished Indians, especially once colonialism had destroyed the local infrastructure and economy, there wasn't as much money to be made. So they often did leave many of the Indians alone. And in fact, by 1570, the Spanish crown developed a new policy. And they said, basically, the Indians are not subject to the Inquisition, even after they convert. So a new Inquisition was set up in Mexico City and another in Lima, Peru in 1570 that was only supposed to prosecute crypto-Jews, crypto-Muslims, and crypto-Protestants. That doesn't mean...
how it went.
Yeah, I mean, it still doesn't mean that the Indians were treated nicely. They were still, they could still be punished and prosecuted by the local bishops, but they were not, it wasn't the Inquisition.
Um, but I wanted to ask, because if you said that they didn't take people who did not convert, but would it be easy if I was a Native American and the Spanish Inquisition came and said, you go back to your old religion? Would it be easier for me to say, hey, I never converted in the first place? So
Yeah.
just lie like that, would that be possible?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and again, we're talking about hundreds of years and thousands of people, so there's every example of this. But in Mexico, for example, many of the Indian elites very quickly learned Spanish and learned Latin even, and became quite good at legal procedures. So yes, we do have a number of people who were quite good at defending themselves in the courts. But of course, the more well-known they were, the harder it was to argue that they weren't baptized because everyone knew they were baptized.
But like if I was just a normal native, it would
Yeah.
be easy to lie. Or did they have records that said that he had converted?
They did, but they were not very reliable. So, I mean, it was pretty easy if you really wanted to escape the Inquisition. You could just leave the village and go to a different village. But again, the Inquisition really wasn't trying that hard to catch most indigenous people. And after 1570, they didn't try at all. So there's not a whole lot of inquisitorial violence against indigenous people. But again, I want to qualify that there was a lot of other kinds of violence against indigenous people. It just wasn't the Inquisition itself.
Yeah.
It was the bishops, it was the army, and so on.
And that will of course be an episode of its own. But what was it well paid to be in Spanish? We thought, and again, I want to refer back to that. We talked about corruption, etc. But was it well paid in the Inquisition itself? Just normal salary?
Yeah, no, it wasn't. And so most of the people who took part in the Inquisition had other jobs. They had other sources of income. Those who were priests would have a benefice. Those who were familiares would have their own lands and so on. And in fact, that was one of the reasons why corruption was so easy to take hold. There were many cases where inquisitors weren't paid anything at all or weren't paid for years. And so they felt quite justified in taking money themselves.
So it was a volunteer job, basically.
For the most part. I mean, you could get some minor stipends. Like there were jailers, there were different people who got a notary would be paid, lawyers would be paid. But again, the payment was generally not that high, and it was not always reliable. So that was a temptation to augment your salary with bribes or corruption.
And when did the Spanish Inquisition dissolve? What were the reasons that they didn't want the Spanish Inquisition there anymore?
Yeah, no, just like it was a gradual process to start it, it was a gradual process to end it. The Spanish, the country of Spain was taken over by a new French monarchy in the 1700s, the Bourbon monarchy. And the 1700s is known as the time of the Enlightenment in Europe.
Yeah.
And the Bourbon were thought of as enlightened monarchs. So they were happy to use the Inquisition politically against their enemies, but they also were very critical of the Inquisition right through the 1700s. And they tried to reform it and make it more an arm of the state and more directly controlled by the government and less religious influence. They also were running out of targets. I mean, by the 1700s, there's really no crypto Jews anymore, no crypto Muslims. So they start prosecuting atheist university students. There were a few witchcraft trials as well. So it was already waning, and it was becoming less and less popular with the elite. One of the last prime ministers of Spain before the Napoleonic invasion was Manuel Godoy, who famously had paintings by the great painter Goya in his apartment, including the Naked Maja, this famous naked painting of a woman. And he got in trouble with the Inquisition because of this. So he really didn't like the Inquisition to begin with. This is around 1800.
So is he part of what dissolves the Spanish Inquisition?
Sorry?
Is he the part of why the Spanish Inquisition was dissolved?
Well, so he was ready to dissolve it anyway. So it was already just about to be closed. But the last straw, well, there's a couple of steps. In 1808, the French invaded. Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, became the ruler of Spain. The French closed the Inquisition in 1808. The Spanish considered this to be illegitimate. So the Inquisition continued in Mexico. It continued in Peru. It also continued in Colombia, where they had a new Inquisition. But the French were kicked out by 1812. The liberal Cortes of Cadiz, Spanish government in exile, voted to end the Inquisition anyway. But then the king was brought back, Ferdinand VII, and he reopened the Inquisition. So it was closed in 1808, then it was reopened by 1814. It lasted another 20 years. It was finally closed for good in 1834. But here's an interesting coda to that. By then, the Spanish Inquisition really wasn't doing much anyway. They were, investigating a few books, a few university professors. But after the Spanish Inquisition closed, that doesn't mean the Inquisition ended.
Mm.
The Inquisition is still around today.
Really? And then what for?
There is a building in Rome, right beside St. Peter's Basilica, which is the headquarters of the Roman Inquisition. And they continued to do the work of the Inquisition right up until today. I've worked there. I've been into their archives.
What is it like?
They have comfy chairs.
So does it persecute people, or are they for believing? What is the job today, if they're still around?
Yeah, I mean, the job theoretically is exactly the same as it always was. It's always in theory been to police and discipline Christians by discovering heresy and then stopping heresy, telling people to stop it and threatening them if they don't. But of course, in the modern world, they don't have the power of the state anymore.
Yeah. People are more religious, tolerable, and people don't really care anymore either.
Exactly. So, I mean, they never had any power over anyone who wasn't living in a Catholic country, right? I mean, they could get mad about Lutherans, but Lutherans in Germany or Norway or England didn't care. It was only if they were in a Catholic country where the government was willing to arrest them and allow an execution to take place. So even today in modern Italy, the Italian government does not allow arrests or torture or executions by the Inquisition. So right now, what the Inquisition has done for the last 100 years in Rome is basically they read books written by Catholic theologians, and they decide which ones are okay and which ones aren't. And when they do find someone to be guilty, and this has happened quite recently, they may make them lose their job if they are working for a Catholic organization, but they don't have any power beyond that.
So they can't execute people anymore on public squares or
Yeah.
anything.
That's right, but they do. I mean, this is still a serious matter among Catholics, and there are a number of Catholic universities, especially in Europe, where you can lose your job if it's called now the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. If they find you guilty, then you can lose your job, and this has happened to a number of people. You may know that the last pope before this one, Benedict XVI, he was the head of the Inquisition before he became the pope.
How do you feel about the Inquisition being around today? You think it's...
Well, yeah, I mean, as a historian, I study a lot of very nasty things. Wars, crusades, inquisitions, witch hunts, all these things are very terrible things. And when even one person is tortured or abused, it's horrific. So, I mean, I certainly have a political and a personal feeling that the Inquisition was always a very, very bad thing. But I also, as a historian, have to take things in perspective and take a more dispassionate view. The Inquisition today is no more sinister or frightening than many police forces or, well, I mean, I teach in a university, and we have discipline for professors who make mistakes or act badly as well. So the world has many forms of discipline. This is one that the Catholic Church uses internally for its own people. So it's not really any of my business. But certainly in history, the Inquisition is responsible for a lot of bloodshed and a lot of misery.
You mentioned that there were a few other countries that had Inquisition as well, but what made the Spanish Inquisition so successful and stay around so long, and of course so famous as it is today?
I think it gets back to politics and also to history and history writing. There was a Portuguese Inquisition, which was quite powerful and lasted up until the 1820s as well. There were a number of inquisitions in different parts of Italy, and there were temporary inquisitions all over Europe. Wherever there was a Catholic hierarchy, you could have a temporary inquisition. Normally, it was just brought in if there was a political problem, a large group of heretics. So why the Spanish Inquisition? Why does it have such a reputation? I would trace it back to all the writings of the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants in the 15 and 1600s. In England, for example, in the Anglophone world that I live in, of course, King Henry VIII made England a Protestant country. His son, Edward, was even more Protestant. But then for a short time, his daughter, Queen Mary, became the Queen of England. And she remained a Catholic. And she actually married King Philip of Spain. And she brought the Spanish Inquisition to England. She was only in power for a few years, but during that time, she had a number of Protestant leaders burned at the stake. This became a major propaganda issue. So English historians, Protestant English historians, have generated thousands of pages just over and over talking about the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition and what we suffered and what could come back again if we ever relax our attention. Because after Mary died, her sister Elizabeth became the queen. And you may know from history, Elizabeth I, and as you know from history, the Spanish Armada tried to invade. So there was a real fear that the Spanish would take control of England even after Mary died. And this generated more and more propaganda to warn people, if we let the Spanish come here, they'll bring the Spanish Inquisition and you and your children will be tortured and burned. So I think that, you know, there is a legitimate reason to complain about the Spanish Inquisition. They did terrible things. Were they worse than the Portuguese Inquisition? Probably not, but they became more famous because they were a bigger political threat. And furthermore, you know, Protestants also burned people at the stake. This wasn't just a Catholic thing. So some of the worst witch hunts in Germany and also in Scandinavia were conducted by Protestants. And many women were burned at the stake and tortured. Also in America, the famous Salem witch trials, these were done by Protestants. So, you know, anytime that anyone tortures and kills a human being, it's terrible. And Catholics did it, Protestants did it. Muslims have done terrible things. Sometimes when Jews have had power, they've done terrible things.
Yeah.
Humanity doesn't need to be one religion or another to treat others terribly.
Yeah.
But because of history, yeah, the Spanish Inquisition.
There's bad Christians, there's good Christians, there's good Jews, there's bad Jews, there's good Muslims, there's bad Muslims.
Yeah.
It's that story.
Power makes people do bad things sometimes.
Yeah. But do you think the Roman Inquisition today should be abolished and just basically do nothing, as like you said?
Well, I mean, it's none of my business. I'm not a Catholic and I'm not involved with the church in any way. But you know, I think that all religions have their own way of determining who is inside and who is outside. And all religions have a way of deciding what is their true faith and what is not. You know, just to take another example from history, Spinoza, the famous Dutch philosopher, he was Jewish and he was expelled by the Jewish community using a legal procedure to expel him because his teachings were considered heretical from the Jewish point of view. So my point there is just that, you know, whether the church has something called the Inquisition, or it's now called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, or whether they develop some other way of policing their own community, doesn't really matter. I mean, I just hope that people will not be cruel and not be unfair.
And of course, I always ask in this case, what did you think of the Roman Atkinson's skits about the Spanish Inquisition?
I like Monty Python. I like Rowan Atkinson. I like the skits. They're very funny. Part of what makes them funny, of course, is just the juxtaposition, the absurdity of it. Historically, interestingly enough, when you look at the Monty Python skit, remember they're all cardinals. They're all wearing red.
Yeah.
That would make them part of the Roman Inquisition, not the Spanish Inquisition. Although in the Monty Python skit, there is one historical character, Cardinal Jimenez. He was the cardinal who brought the Inquisition to Granada, and he was the one who started to use it against crypto Muslims. So there is some history there, but mostly it's absurd and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. Before you go, do you have anything you wish to promote on the social media and a link you want me to put in the description of this episode?
Well, I do have a website through the University of Notre Dame, which has a number of Inquisition documents from that collection that I mentioned at the beginning that got me interested in the first place. So if anyone wants to see those documents, many of them are scanned or otherwise described on the Notre Dame website. And I hope to have a book out very soon about the Index of Prohibited Books, which was what the Inquisition used to tell everyone which books were bad and which books should be burned.
Sounds fascinating. My name is Alan. This has been 1.h12. We are available on Spotify, YouTube, wherever Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts. We are also on Instagram under well.h12. My guest today has been Robin Voses. I hope I said that right. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks very much.